Another point I would like to cover briefly is potential sources for this the trends in this debate, not economic sources, but rather political sources. And I'd recommend to the committee and its staff an excellent report put out earlier this fall by the Pew Charitable Trusts, which examines very specifically not so much the question of economic inequality, but rather the lessening of economic mobility in our society. In past, what we've seen in the political landscape is that many working class and middle class voters are reluctant to support tax increases on the wealthy, because many working class, the majority of working class and middle class voters, tend to be very aspirational as to their own economic prospects or those of their children. And so they've been a little bit more reluctant, even if they currently wouldn't be paying those taxes, to take a little bit of poetic license. They hope to be paying those taxes someday. But according to the Pew Trust report, as mobility has shrunk in the society, working and middle class voters have become much less protective of the tax code as it currently stands. And they cite as evidence for this, they say they divide the society into 5 quintiles, which I guess is the best number of quintiles to divide society into. And their analysis shows that roughly 17% of those Americans born in the lowest 1/5 quintile will ultimately rise to one of the highest 2/5. And that is a level of economic mobility that is now significantly less than that of most of the Western democracies. And so I would suggest to the committee that it is that lack of economic mobility, that diminishing level of economic mobility, which is driving the change in the political discourse.
If I can just ask you on that point, is that also perceived? Can you measure the extent that I took your 17% to be what actually is the reality? Mm-hmm. And what's the perception, if you know? Or as is
the case in most areas, perception is a lagging indicator of reality. And that said, most Americans still perceive the American dream of upward mobility to be intact, but the numbers for that perception have been dropping as well, though not quite as dramatically as the figures provided by Pew on economic reality. The Pew study goes on to talk about the sources of that economic inequality, and this is something that's been discussed previously in this hearing, but what they pointed to particularly were the crises in the real estate and in the credit sectors, essentially wiping out the nest eggs for most working class and middle class voters, creating a much greater level of inequality that existed prior to the real estate collapse of the latter part of last decade. As far as prescriptions, they talked about an increased safety net, but noted somewhat ironically that at the same time this debate is taking place, most of the Western European democracies, which have been known for a stronger safety net, are in the process of lessening some of those protections in the interest of financial austerity and economic growth. They also talk about taxes, and as you've discussed earlier, the inherent tension between progressivity and volatility. But also, and this is something several of the other people here today have talked about, is the critical importance of education. And what I'd like to close with, if I can, are some findings from our most recent USC Dornsife LA Times poll, particularly as it relates to public education in California, because as those who preceded me to this chair have noted, ultimately the public education is the key engine for economic growth in the state and elsewhere. First of all, we asked Californians to grade their public schools on the same A to F level that schools grade their students. And I know the members of this committee are very familiar with what's known by the acronym of NIMBY. The NIMBY phenomenon, not in my backyard. No trash dumps, no prisons, no bad things. Interestingly enough, when it comes to California's public schools, there is what I would call a GIMBY phenomena. And in fact, Californians are much more positive about the public schools in their own community than the state as a whole. When asked to give grades for California's public schools generally, the overall grade comes between a C and a C minus. When asked about public schools that their children or grandchildren attend or that exist in their own neighborhoods and communities, Californians are much more generous and give those schools a B or a B plus. As some of my predecessors stated here today, there's no question that voters want to see more money spent in our public schools. But interestingly enough, when they've talked about barriers to success in our public schools, on an almost equal level, they talked about the level of education, the education bureaucracy as being an equal obstacle to that of lack of funding, and they rate lack of parental involvement as the highest obstacle. Voters also recognize the need very specifically for additional money for schools in economically deprived communities, and by a margin of 66% to 17%, talked about deploying additional financial resources to the schools in the most economically depressed communities as a necessity. That number dropped by about 20 points when we rephrased the question to ask, do you want to see more money spent in these economically deprived community schools, even if it means taking money from wealthier communities? And so the numbers are still very high, 57 to 25 in favor, but it's about an 18 to 20% drop. By a 41% to 49% margin, Californians say that currently UC and CSU education in California is unaffordable. And as you might suspect, that number becomes much, much higher when you break out 21 to 25 or 18 to 25-year-olds, those who are more likely than not to be experiencing that obstacle, and the parents of those 18 to 25-year-olds are much more dour as to the affordability of a public university education as well. Very interesting. We asked the voters if they would be willing to pay higher taxes to support their public schools. And as I think all of you know, generally when public opinion polls are taken, voters will say at the general level, we want a budget solved by a combination of tax increases and spending cuts. And then when you dig a little bit deeper, you find that the spending cuts they want are not in K-12 education, not in higher education, not in healthcare, not in public safety, not in environmental protection, and not in transportation or housing. The three areas, according to our polling earlier this year, where voters identified willingness to cut spending is, number one, cellular phones for state employees. They thought that was a fine idea. And they also supported cuts in spending on prisons and on public employee pensions, which, at least to me, suggests that voters are willing to cut spending on areas that do not affect them or anyone they know.
Nor garner us enough money to pay for all the services that they do want.
Precisely. And then when you get to taxes, the exact same phenomena holds. Californians are willing to raise taxes, we have found. But they generally, as we've seen historically, have been willing to raise taxes on other people, on smokers, on gamblers, on oil companies, and on the wealthy. And in fact, it has not been since 1993, since Californians voted at the ballot to impose a general tax increase on all Californians. And we can talk about the historical peculiarities of that if you'd like before I'm shooed out of here. So what we did in our poll is, rather than just asking if Californians were willing to pay higher taxes for their public schools, because we knew they'd say yes, because they figure Mr. Dickinson is going to be paying the higher taxes, not me. We asked them, would you be willing to see taxes raised to pay for public schools, even if it meant increasing your own taxes? And we asked that question very specifically. And by a 2-to-1 margin, 64% to 32%, Californians said, in fact, that they would be willing to pay higher taxes for public schools. It's our supposition, based on the results from any number of local ballot measures that were on the ballot this past November, that most Californians, by the way the poll was conducted, assume that money would be spent in their local and neighborhood schools rather than coming up here to evil Sacramento. And I put quotation marks around evil for those of you who are reading the transcript. What we will do when we poll early next year is break out their willingness to pay higher taxes for local schools and for a statewide public school system. Finally, and this gets to a point that one of my predecessors made, we asked Californians about public school teachers. And as near as I can tell, public school teachers are among the most popular people on this planet. Individually, when we ask about teachers' unions, the result becomes somewhat more conflicted, and I'm happy to talk about that if you like. But we asked them if they thought the teachers were paid too much, too little, or just right. And overwhelmingly, not surprisingly, Californians said that their public school teachers were not paid enough. But where this becomes particularly interesting, and this is where I'll wind up, is we asked them how teachers' salaries should be determined. And only 11% of respondents said that seniority, number of years in the classroom, should be the basis on which salary should be set. The similar percentage said advanced degrees or advanced training. Only 10% said that a teacher's salary should be based only on the test scores of their students. More than 50%, though, said that a combination of performance-based factors, Testing, classroom visits, peer evaluation, and others should be the basis for which teachers' salaries should be set. And when we broke down the question a little bit more directly, what we found is that we asked voters what percentage of a teacher's evaluation should be set according to their students' test scores, and the mean came out to roughly 48%. So Californians certainly recognize the need for greater investment in our public schools as an engine of economic growth, and particularly want to see our public school teachers paid more. But they have a serious disagreement with the current system by which the salaries are determined. As is my habit from a half career in politics, I've talked much longer than I intended, and I apologize for that. And if there's any time left, I'd be more than happy to.
Well, thank you very much. An empiricist would love to spend more hours just probing what you've been talking about. But I'm going to limit myself to one question fundamentally, and that is, given what you've told us and what you've seen beyond what you've been able to express this morning, and recognizing your comment of the impact of the views embodied in the Occupy movement and their power, weight, and staying ability over at least the next year, the next election cycle. Given the context we have of lots of people out there talking about qualifying initiatives that are tax measures in one way or the other, and given your long history before you adopted an academic role, what kind of advice would you give the legislature about action in the coming year regarding the topic of taxes and income inequality, restoring the economy, hopefully, in the process?
You know, I spoke earlier about the seeming paradox in the findings of the ABC poll between people who wanted to see a millionaire's tax but also wanted to see a smaller government providing fewer services. In fact, I would suggest to you that those two views are not quite as incongruous as they sound. And I'd encourage you to look to New York State and what Governor Cuomo has accomplished there since taking office. And I mean that not as a slight on Governor Brown, because I admire him greatly for his efforts here. But Governor Cuomo received a huge amount of attention this week for maintaining a tax on the highest earners in New York State. But I think what's particularly instructive about what Governor Cuomo did is before he moved to impose that tax on the wealthiest New Yorkers, he took very aggressive steps to reduce state spending. And I think what he realized there, as Governor Brown has correctly realized here, is that in order to have the credibility to ask voters for additional financial resources, it's incumbent on elected officials to exhibit their financial responsibility. And while I take no side in the debate over public employee pensions, I will note, just from a public opinion standpoint, that Governor Brown is absolutely correct in stressing that issue as a necessary precursor for the fight that's likely to take place on next November's ballot.
As a political predicate, as opposed to a financial predicate in the immediate time.
Precisely. I am not arguing the substance of it one way or another. There's smarter people than me to do that. But as a political predicate, either the governor's proposal or many of the others that are currently out gathering signatures stand a much greater chance of success if Californians view their elected officials as taking what they perceive to be necessary steps to rein in state spending. We polled earlier this year on the public employee question and found very, very strong support for the governor's for the governor's position. So what I'd say, regardless of whether you personally think that the governor's proposal or Molly Munger's or Think Long's or the California Federation of Teachers or any or all of the above are the right thing to do, I think that Governor Brown is absolutely correct from a political standpoint in urging action on pension reform before asking voters to move forward with a potential set of revenue increases.
Yeah, I think the dilemma is even if one, for the purposes of discussion, accepted the notion that we adopt the most drastic suggestions regarding pensions, we don't save much in the state budget in the immediate. We save 3% of
and that's why I emphasize that it's a political precursor rather than an economic precursor.
Right.
There's a separate discussion to be had about the long-term financial obligations, but what we see in our polling, and have seen in others also, is that voters see public employee benefits at an almost symbolic level of a government that they believe spends money injudiciously.
Well, it's a fascinating question. I was reading an opinion piece from a publication out of the Los Angeles area yesterday about legislators having no more cars.
Yeah.
And it said, which I didn't expect to see. It said, it's probably going to cost us more if legislators are reimbursed by the mile, but we don't care because it's the symbol of the cars going away. Now, I'm not debating the car issue on its substance. It just was fascinating to see. It's going to cost us more, but we like it because of the symbolism.
Well, I'll offer you two thoughts on that point. Voters are not only are voters not always rational, but voters are usually aware of that. We have done public.
They're aware that they're not rational
when it comes to particular matters of politics and governance. And an example I will offer you is the ongoing debate over term limits. We have done not only polling but focus groups and mall intercepts and other types of public opinion research on term limits. And most voters readily concede the fact that it leads to a less experienced legislative branch. They recognize that it leads to an increase in the influence of lobbyists. They recognize that it leads to an outflux, if there's such a word, of experienced staff. And they still support term limits. So they agree with every single argument against it and then continue to support it, recognizing that the rational answer is not nearly as satisfying as the alternative. The second point I'd make, Mr. Chairman, on the question of cars for the legislators is the unsolicited advice from a former political consultant that I would offer to incumbent legislators of both parties is to brag in their ads next year about giving their cars back and see if that can win you a few extra votes.
I didn't have one to give back, so I won't be able to take that advice. But and I think that what we will struggle with is the prescription of dealing with, say, pensions as the political predicate makes sense. The cuts that are going to get made are exactly to the areas that we've been talking about need more investment, K through 12 education and higher education, as well as other social services.
Yeah. And I did not mean to single out pensions from my own perspective, but noting only that the governor came in here before another legislative committee to talk about it the week before coming forward with his proposal. And from a strictly political standpoint, that was a very smart set of timing decisions.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. You start asking, you just want to keep asking. Ms. Mitchell?
I just, first of all, wanted to clarify that I certainly didn't want my friends who are Trojans to assume that I was only extending an invitation to UC campuses to come and participate. And the point of me explicitly extending the invitation is, interim hearings are wonderfully informative, where we have the time and the luxury to have meaningful, thoughtful dialogue, and for legislators to learn about some of the critical, some of the current research and academic thought behind the issues we confront on a practical basis every day. The challenge is January 4th or 5th when we reconvene, and the culture, there's a sea change that occurs in this building. January 10th when a budget is released, and all the wonderful things that you've shared with us go out some magical window, and we begin to have very different dialogues. So the point was really, I think, for students and you all to come here and witness that and to really kind of understand the dynamic that happens in this building when we are really debating these very, very critical issues. You're right. What we will be confronted with during the inevitable trigger conversation and subsequent next year's budget discussion is counter to everything you have counseled us today. And so really the invitation was to understand and be a part of the sea change that will occur here in just a very few weeks. And in terms of the advice, I think that we need to take ourselves in terms of how to address this issue is go big or go home. The future of California really rests in our hands in terms of what kind of investment we're going to be willing to make. Or are we willing to look your children in the eye in 20 years when they recognize that your move from Maryland to California compromised their future income earning potential and say that in 2011 we did the best we could possibly to guarantee their future. And we will be the bearers of that.
Well, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention and for your invitation.
Absolutely. I do think we are in a critical period with respect to the direction we take in this state. We ought not to adopt the view that the issues we've been discussing this morning can only be affected at the national or international level. I do think there are things that we can do if we're prepared and have the intestinal fortitude and the political courage to undertake them. We can make a difference for Californians, and we have an obligation to try to do that on an informed basis, and that's why your testimony, I think, has been extremely helpful in the context of the other comments and remarks we've heard this morning. So thank you again very much.
Thank you.
We're a little bit later than we anticipated. We do have some limited time for public testimony if there's anybody who wishes to address the committee. Sure. Well, we're going to have to limit it to about 2 minutes, but
we're used to that because I speak every Tuesday to the city council.
okay.
Mainly,
if you'd also introduce yourself, just so
Mac, M-A-C, Worthy, last name Worthy, 44 years, small business in Sacramento.
Thank you, sir.
And I live in your district, Roger.
Thank you.
Now, majority of what I heard, I don't buy half of it because statistics don't count economics. Now, 1981, 90% of what was said here today, I gave the presentation in Oak Park. Low-income housing, all of it. Crime, unemployed, I gave it. Now, what the 99% people, I encourage them of what they're doing. But I would like to see the legislation get politics out of wealth, economics. Connect those kids to the wealth, which I put on the screen $60 million from Forbes, $60 million from Saudi Arabia, and we invest our own money. Politics from legislation become policies which cost us more. That's when people leave California. I wouldn't say one time, unless you amend the Constitution, to put an extra tax on a wealthy man. Bargain with these young kids like here. That's who, instead of you all. You all oversee what they bargain instead of tax because you tap it with your Constitution when you say the wealth pay more per dollar than the poor man. Those things have to be put in. From K to 12, I beg people to keep public education. The economics of public education is local. Take that out of this city and you'll see the city fall on its face. Housing. I'd like to see Brown go on and pull the trigger. That was abuse of redevelopers. Oak Park, show you some things. I hope the grand jury come and I'll point them to where the money was abused. But the governor had to be the mayor in Oakland before he found out facts. He could have come to me. Merrill Beach told me, he said, go to tell our boy to go to South Carolina boy. That's Tim Scott's people. Which I'm Republican, I get very little information. We have to understand business. And my people, the 60 movements, yes, I oppose the 60 movements. I dropped out of Morris College and came here. Why could we get the statistics that these people got to study volume, economics, but we didn't. I plowed a mule. I drove a tractor. I milked cows. My daddy never knew I would make almost $70,000 a year. But it's only the individual. The anxiety within the individual. You can put $1 billion from K to 12 and don't put nothing with own hands, you're not going to get anything from it. You got to have own hands, something to do with their hands to lead there. We're trying to put together now to teach janitorial work. Teach them to go and get you a job and think about it. You can't make no money on an 8-hour job. When you hear one person say raw money. If you never bring your money in raw, you'll never be wealthy in this country. And what I mean by raw, you spend the money before the tax system take theirs out. And that's when the wealthy people's big money is coming off investments.
Okay, we need you to conclude there, if you would.
Anyway, I would like to see the things narrowed down and go with one guy talked to antitrust, and I'd like to show the highest paid young black man in America is under antitrust law, which is a privilege. And then nonprofit organizations. We'd like to see those things cut and teach people to get out of that and go to profit and loss.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Worthy. Anyone else who'd like to address the committee? Yes, sir. Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is David Whitkin. I'm a student at California State University, Sacramento. I do appreciate you guys actually offering your time to address this issue. It is very important. I realize you didn't have to do that, so we do appreciate that. I'm kind of sad that Ms. Huber left because I did want to address, she seemed to feel like there's not a lot that we can do about federal issues on a state level. I vehemently disagree with that. I believe that because you are our representatives, you have access, first of all, to the federal government. You have credibility. I do believe that people would consider Roger Dickinson's opinion in Washington much more important than David Whitkin's. So I believe that that was a little bit disingenuous for Ms. Huber. I do appreciate the fact that you stated that you need to have the political fortitude to make these important decisions. It is very important that as our representatives you lead. I realize you're concerned about, potential ramifications of making such decisions, but the problem with our country today is the fact that our politicians have avoided making the tough decisions that may be necessarily unpopular with, for example, corporate interests. But you do represent the people, not financial interests and not, any other interest. We are your constituency. And the most important thing is public education. We have to invest in our future because if we don't, we have no future. And it's not acceptable to say that, we're being, like I believe Ms. Mitchell said, we're being forced into the wrong decisions because of the political discourse or the environment. That can't happen. This is why our country is falling apart. California in particular is in a disastrous position. We have a prison industrial complex. Jobs are not being created. They're actually disappearing. Something has to be done. And seeing as how you guys are the ones in position to do it, we, as your constituency, expect you guys to do something about it. So I do appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you, and thank you for the encouragement to do our job. We need to hear that from time to time. So
I wish there was more people here to encourage you guys to do it.
Thanks very much. Okay. Anyone else who'd like to speak?
Hi.
Hi.
How you guys doing?
We're doing okay.
My name is Christopher MacDonald. I wanted to speak to you specifically on the point of investment in the education system. I was fortunate enough that the school that I went to while I was living in Southern California had advanced placement classes available as early as first grade. So I was able to do gifted and talented education, and I did a majority of that in elementary school. In high school, I was able to do AVID and a couple of advanced placement courses, and then also do simultaneous enrollment of my freshman year at Chico State as well as my senior year at Paradise High School. So I can say firsthand that knowing that those programs are available and being able to be a part of those programs is extremely important. And I would venture so far as to say probably the only reason that I was able to actually get into college was because of those types of programs being available. I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot in the way of resources. We lived on welfare. We saw welfare get gutted. We've seen a lot of these programs that are really necessary for these lower income families start to disappear, and our investments have been more focused on short-term gains rather than long-term goals. And so I'd really encourage you to look at finding ways to make sure that those lower income families have the same opportunities that my family was able to have. I'm still in school now, and unfortunately, because of our current economic situation, I am unemployed. I've been filling out 100 applications, going around trying to do interviews, things like that, while going to school. One of the other points that was made is there are a lot of individuals that are enrolled in college but are not graduating. I think a lot of those individuals fall into the scenario that I'm in, which is that in order for me to be able to get to school, I have to have monetary resources. In order for me to have those monetary resources, I either have to bury myself in debt, which is unexcusable. There's no reason that I, as a student, should have to owe $65,000 to $70,000 to be able to get an education. My great-grandfather had an opportunity to share some of his stories. When he was going to school, community colleges were free. He paid almost nothing to be able to access the CSU and UC systems, and those things just don't exist anymore. So I'd really like to see that we find a way to invest in that, because putting a power plant in or making a contract with a railroad company or building a high-speed rail system, they're all great ideas to make some money. But honestly, if we don't start looking at the importance of education and really, really focusing on that, we're going to be in this exact same situation, if not worse off.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments and your attendance. Anyone else? Okay. Just before we adjourn, I want to mention for those who may be interested that the remarks that have been submitted in writing and the charts, as well as related information to the hearing today, is available on the committee's website, and the address is www.asm.ca.gov/accountability. So it's available there. With that, thank you all again for your attendance and your contributions, and we are adjourned.